Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started here. We just had a couple of business things before we get into the program, since this is going to be our new normal, so to speak. We want to first, as I mentioned in my email, we're going to vote on we normally vote on new officers and directors in May, announce them in April, but with the virus and all, obviously none of that happened. So as I mentioned in the email, we're going to vote tonight. So just, raise your hand if you would agree. And the officers are President, which is me, John Kennington. Jay Pruitt will be Vice President. Mary Jackson, Treasurer. Secretary, Julia Harris, who's on here. And then our new directors will be Christy Leach, Josh Smith, and Zach Poland. I don't know if those guys are on or not tonight, but Josh is here, I saw. He's waving. So, if anybody has any nominations to make, I'll just do the normal official request. Okay, if not, then I would just say all in favor of the slate of officers, just please raise your hand or do a thumbs up, or have a thumbs up maybe.
Well, I don't have a picture on there, but I'll say thumbs up, so.
Okay, yeah. I mean, if it's contentious, we can use the poll thing on here, but I think a thumbs up or a wave is good enough. Okay. Okay, well now we're semi-official. Our bylaws don't cover voting in virtual meetings, but hey, we're going to do the best we can here.
Hey, John, Oklahoma passed a law saying that nonprofits could use virtual meetings now for official meetings.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Huh. Wow. Well, okay, we're official that way, so at least we won't get in trouble with the state of Oklahoma. Let's see. Now, Paul had sent me, and Paul, I'm glad you're here, but I'll just mention on the recorder's report. And we've talked a little bit about the fact that we had some really cool birds from the hurricane. We had a frigate bird at Lake Yohola, which several of you got to see. Then there was 2 Jaegers that flew by. Steve Metz identified them as a parasitic and a long-tailed Jaeger. Then there was
identify those.
What's that?
He had experts identify those. He didn't identify them.
Oh, he didn't. Okay, from the photo, he got photos, right? I guess
they were very good too. Of course.
Yeah. And then there was later that week we had a white ibis, a juvenile white ibis at Mingo Creek, and a black-bellied whistling duck in Owasso. And we had some early arrivals like pintail, scaup, eared grebe, marsh wren, prothonotary warbler, magnolia warbler, western kingbird, and purple martin, either early departures or arrivals. And that lesser scaup spent the summer in Tulsa, Paul mentioned, too, so that's unusual. So thank you, Paul, for that, for compiling all that.
No problem.
And let's see, so just now to mention just a couple other quick things. Todd Humphrey is teaching his All About Birds class at Jenks Community Ed. It'll obviously be an online, Zoom type class, but this is all in the email that went out. We did our elections. Mary, do you want to talk about Monarchs on the Mountain real quick?
Monarchs on the Mountain is this Saturday. It's going to be mostly virtual also, and I will pin that post to the top of the TS Facebook page tonight after this. There are a couple events where people are going to be doing some planting, either out Turkey Mountain, out at Oxley Nature Center, or out at the Tulsa Garden Center. And so, but those are individual events that you have to go onto their website to sign up for. So, and also then you can also take a tour of like gardens, and all that information is going to be online. Sorry, I'm outside. So all that information is going to be online at the Facebook site, and I will have that link up on Tulsa Audubon's Facebook page.
Okay, well, thank you. Our meeting, October 2nd and 4th is the Oklahoma Bio Blitz, and that will also be virtual. And we'll have a link. It's not there yet, but tonight I'll get that on the Audubon Facebook, on the Audubon webpage on our calendar. October 10th, we are doing Saturday morning birders. We're not doing many other field trips, but Saturday morning birders are going out. That's October 10th. And October 20th is our next meeting, which is going to be with Jeff Cox talking about making your backyard bird friendly. So that's what's coming up for Tulsa Audubon.
It's Anita. I got one more. I'm giving free Purple Martin seminars at my house on the end of the month, September 25th and 26th, on how to establish a Purple Martin colony. So if anybody's interested, there's a couple Facebook events out there for that.
Okay. Do you have that as an event on Facebook?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's a link, but I can do it again. We had flyers at the garden tour, so hopefully some people could.
Okay. I'll look for that and add it to the web page and to our web calendar.
It is a social distancing event with mask, even though we're outside. You don't have to wear the mask unless you get up close to somebody else, then you got to put the mask on.
Yep. Thank you. Okay. I think that's it. So, Jay, would you like to, let me see if I can switch you here. Jay Pruitt will introduce Nate, our speaker, and let me find him here. Let me try this. Okay, Jay, go ahead.
All right, can you hear me all right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I cannot think of a time when we have had a more timely presentation than this one. The recorder's report that we just heard. We don't often see birds from the ocean here, but once in a while. But they are incredibly fascinating. And we are very fortunate tonight to have Nate Swick, who is Digital Communications Manager with the American Birding Association, join us, and he's going to talk to us about pelagic birds in the blue desert of the Gulf of Mexico. And he is from Greensboro, North Carolina, where he lives with his wife and two sons, and or two young children. And he has written two books, Beginner's Guide to Birding and the ABA Field Guide to Birds of the Carolinas. And we are very pleased to have Nick with us tonight. So Nick, we'll turn it over to you. And then when you get through, we'll have time for a few questions, I hope. Thanks for.
Okay, and I will, let me switch this over to, and then again, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody here. If I can figure out how to do all that. Okay, there we go, Nate.
Hello,
And
hello, everybody. Everyone can hear me fine?
Yes, great.
Perfect. Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's Nate, by the way, not Nick, although you are hardly the first to to skip the middle part of my name. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here talking to the folks here in Tulsa. It's actually not far from where I grew up. I grew up in Southwest Missouri in the Springfield area. So that part of the country is very close to my heart. We used to take family trips down to Tulsa and go to the zoo and the art museum and stuff like that when I was a kid. So it's great to talk to y'all. And yeah, I hear you've been seeing some seabirds in Oklahoma. I hope you appreciate my teaser for my program. I sent those your way. I'm glad that you all got them. All right, I'm going to try and share my screen here. I hope that this works. Is that all right with everybody? I'm going to try and blow that up. So,
yes, it looks good.
All right. Are we all good? All right.
Yeah.
You can see, should say it's a little tight for me, but if it says American Birding Association for you, we're going to be good.
We're good.
All right. Great. Thanks. All right. So yeah, this is a part of the world that I'm a little bit of a transplant here to North Carolina. But I have lived here for almost 15 years now. And one of the things that I love about this part of the world has been getting to know the seabirds here in the Gulf Stream off the Atlantic coast of the country. So I call this birding the blue desert because this part of the world, it does feel very much like a desert. You look out over the ocean and it feels like a featureless blue mass of nothing. But of course, with all these sorts of wide open spaces, I'm sure you folks in Oklahoma know this as much as anybody. If you look a little bit closer at these seemingly arid, empty places, there's a lot of things to love about it. And there's another reason why this is very much like the desert, is because when we think of the desert, we think of a place that is there's very little food or water, and the organisms that live in those places have to be adapted very perfectly for this habitat, which frequently requires having to travel long distances without food, having to take advantage of food when you get it. And that's very much the ocean. There's a lot of food in there. There are a lot of organisms in there, but it is not spread out. It is kind of imperfectly spread out. It's not even across the entirety of the ocean. There are places where by currents, because of undersea features, because of any number of things, are particularly good for life. And the area off the coast of North Carolina where I live is one of those places, and I'll talk about why that is. But it would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the birds that we're going to learn about tonight. And those are what we think of are called pelagic species. Pelagic is from the ancient Greek, from pelagos, which means the ocean. These are all ocean-going species that are exceptionally well adapted to living in this extremely harsh place. But first, let's give a little background. Oh, so the ones we have here, these are some 4 kind of good examples of pelagic species. We have a white-tailed tropic bird up in the corner. On the upper right, a small flock of Wilson storm petrels. And down at the bottom, the black-capped petrel, which is very much the classic bird of the Gulf Stream ecosystem. And then a Corey shearwater down in the lower part. So just as sort of a primer of what we're talking about here in terms of ocean-going birds and ocean-going ocean habitats. The ocean moves. We don't often think of it as a river, but it moves much like a river. And a lot of these are with these currents that cycle throughout the oceans, the great oceans of the world. And the one that we're going to be talking about is, let me see if I can put a little. Try. Oops, there's got to be a way to, I was testing this out earlier, and there was a way to use a little, well, anyway, forget it. Anyway, so if you look up the east coast of the North America, you'll see what we're talking about here called the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is one of the largest of these currents that bring nutrients, bring water, bring warm water, cold water throughout the North Atlantic. It's part of the North Atlantic Gyre, this sort of circle that runs around the middle of it. That runs around the North Atlantic. And bear with me. This is my first Zoom presentation I've ever done. So I've got 2 images here that give you 2 slightly different ways to look at this part of the world, of this Gulf Stream. On the left is an image that shows sea surface temperature. And so what you can see is that very dark red finger that is sort of running up the coast of North America. That is the Gulf Stream. So with the Gulf Stream, it starts in the Gulf of Mexico, from whence it gets its name, curls around the Straits of Florida. So between Florida, the southern tip of Florida, and Cuba, there is a very deep trench, and it kind of curves up through there around Florida and then up the coast. And where it comes closest, it comes pretty close to the coast quite a bit. But the important thing about North Carolina, you can see the state of North Carolina here in the Outer Banks right there, is that you've got this cold water that comes down right next to it. And it's that rubbing of the warm water versus the cold water that is really important when we're talking about organisms and how animals use this place. Another characteristic of this area. You can see on the right image, which is an image of the undersea features. So most of the Atlantic is pretty flat. In the middle, there's a big mountain range that runs down the middle that's slowly spreading, pushing the Atlantic wider and wider and wider at like centimeters a year. But what we have here off the coast of North America is what we call the continental shelf. And at that point right here, it's like a big cliff face, and that cliff face drops off. So we go from something like 250 feet just off the coast of North Carolina to where it drops off to something like 3,000, like all at once. And you can see where this shelf comes closest to the coast is right off the southeast of Hatteras, which is on the little tip of the Outer Banks, which is why Hatteras, North Carolina is such an important place if you want to go and see some of these birds. So it's this combination of this drop off of the continental shelf and then the Labrador Current, which is this cold water that comes down past New Jersey, Delaware, all that, and the Gulf Stream. These three things together are swirling the water up, it's mixing the water up, and it's this mixture that is causing all these sorts of organisms to come to the surface. And it's why there's so many birds, and not just birds, but all sorts of organisms that are sort of attracted to this one spot on the map. And if you're looking out at the ocean, it might seem like nothing, but below the surface and because of the temperature is something very special going on. And what that looks like when you're out on the ocean, you can actually see where these temperature gradients are meeting. So what you have is this dark blue, this deep blue, warm water that's about 80 degrees. It's like bath water. It's super warm. And then you've got this colder kind of green, gray water that is closer to the shore, that is sort of where the Labrador Current is. And that is about, 60 degrees. So it's a pretty drastic temperature change. And when these two bodies of water kind of come together, they can cause some issues. And one of the things that you see where the line where these two, where the warm water and the cold water mix, is what's called the sargassum line. And what this sargassum is it's an algae. Actually, it looks like a plant, looks like a seaweed, but it's a floating algae. You may have heard of the Sargasso Sea. You may be familiar with that. It's kind of in the Caribbean all the way up to North Carolina. And so what this happens is on one side of this is the cold water, and on the other side is the warm water, and they're running past each other. And there's this kind of area in the middle where there isn't much movement, and it kind of squishes all this kind of floating vegetation into it. And what makes this really special is that this area is home to a lot of different organisms. And if you dip like a net into the sargassum and you pull it up and you start picking through all this algae, this seaweed, it's not seaweed in the sense that seaweed is a plant, but it's an algae. You get all sorts of cool critters. It's super important not only for as a fish nursery, so there's a ton of what we think of as game fish, mahi-mahi, billfish like sailfish, swordfish, marlin, things like that. All of them use this sargassum as a nursery. And there's also cool little crabs and all sorts of neat things in there. Baby sea turtles use it because that's where they live until they get big enough to kind of swim in the open ocean and not get eaten by some of the larger fish. So this sargassum is really important. There's a ton of organisms in here, which is another thing that's attracting a lot of birds and sea mammals and things like that. But one of the things that's going on that a lot of people don't realize is that at this area is a migration, and it's a migration that happens every single night. And in fact, in terms of biomass, this is one of the largest migrations on the planet. It's just that the things that are migrating are these super, super tiny zooplankton. So during the day, the sargassum is up at the surface. It's getting CO2 from the sun. The sun is very intense out there. As you imagine, there's no shade. And all these little critters and stuff that feed on this phytoplankton live way down in the ocean. But when the sun goes down and it's nighttime, all of them come out of what's called this mesopelagic zone, more than 100 feet down, where it's frequently very dark. And they all come up into this part of the higher near the surface. And they do this every single night. And so a lot of these birds that we think of as seabirds are frequently nocturnal. That's where they get most of their food, is because they're flying around at night. A lot of them have really big eyes, and they're picking at the shrimps and the fish and all the stuff that migrates up at night. And during the day, when birders are out there on a boat looking for them, a lot of times they're just kind of lounging on the water or cruising along, trying to find, a fishing boat or a dead animal or whatever floating on the surface that they can eat. But they do most of their feeding at night during this huge migration. And so that's all of this makes this part of the world, this little continental shelf. I keep pointing at my picture on my screen, and I know that you can't see that. I apologize. Old habits die hard. But there is this little area off the coast of North Carolina where the continental shelf is very close, where the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current all intersect, is this really critical oasis in this blue desert. And that's one of the reasons why this is such a critical place for seabirds. And it attracts seabirds that are coming from all over the Atlantic, and in fact all over the world. And this map shows a little bit. So what you've got are Caribbean nesting birds like this black-capped petrel and this Audubon shearwater that nest in the Caribbean islands and travel all the way up to off the coast of North Carolina or off the east coast of the United States to feed every single day. And you've got Arctic nesting birds, which in the late spring, which is a great time of year to see a great diversity of seabirds, are still moving north, trying to get to their Arctic breeding grounds. And for these, I think of things like Leach's storm petrel, Arctic tern, which is, famously has these massive migrations, and the Jaegers, like the ones you've seen recently. Jaegers are particularly interesting because I think a lot of them migrate over the continent, but they do it in like one big jump. And so they don't get knocked down very often unless there's like a heavy weather system. So things like long-tailed Jaeger and parasitic Jaeger probably fly over Oklahoma every year, but it takes something like a storm, like a hurricane, to knock them down so that people can see them, which is pretty fascinating. We have birds that breed on islands off the coast of Africa, in the Eastern Atlantic. They all come to the Gulf Stream. And then we've got birds that breed in the circum-Antarctic, sub-Antarctic islands. So things like Wilson storm petrel, sooty shearwater. These are all things that are breeding around the Antarctic and islands in the southern oceans and are coming all the way up to the North Atlantic to feed every single year. So it's this really amazing combination of seabirds, of ocean life, all in this one part, relatively small part of the world, which makes it amazing that we can even see them, because the ocean is a huge place and the boats that we go out on are not very big. And so the fact that we intersect with these things at all is pretty remarkable. So we're going to talk a little bit about what a pelagic species is. So a pelagic species is an ocean-going species. The classic pelagic species are what we call these Procellariformes, tube noses, things like shearwaters, storm petrels, and albatrosses. These species are particularly suited for cruising over open oceans. They do this thing called dynamic soaring, where they barely even have to move their wings. They're taking advantage of these little bitty tiny thermals. We're familiar with things like turkey vultures taking advantage of thermals from warming air and rising way up in the sky. Tube noses do this too, except that the thermals that they are using are these little tiny microthermals that happen in the troughs of the waves, and they're using these to kind of cruise without even moving. It's pretty remarkable, without even moving their wings. It's pretty amazing. But there are other birds that are considered pelagic species as well. Tropic birds, even though they are not, they're more closely related to pelicans and cormorants. And also seagoing larids. Larids are gulls and terns. Jaegers and skuas are frequently thought of as pelagic species. Arctic tern, even though they don't sit on the water, like they don't have, like a duck or a shearwater or storm petrel might sit on the water. Arctic terns tend not to do that, but they're still thought of as pelagic species. They migrate way out in the middle of the ocean. And seagoing gulls, like Sabin's gull, is a great example of that one. And that one shows up in the interior of the continent every once in a while too. So, but the classic pelagic species, the classic seabirds, are tube noses. And they're called tube noses because, well, you can see in this image, they have this weird little nose that sticks out, and it's shaped like a tube. And it's just part of their skeleton system. And this is this is a way that they are able to essentially drink salt water, and using organs in their head are able to extract the salt from that water so that they can drink it without dehydrating and dying. And then they expel the salt through those little tube noses by sneezing. So they sneeze the salt out. They drink salt water and they sneeze the salt out. It's a pretty ingenious adaptation, pretty amazing, and obviously essential if you're going to be spending almost all of your time out on the open ocean where there is no fresh water. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more, some of the classics, some of the more interesting shorebirds that one can expect to see, or not shorebirds, seabirds that one can expect to see in the North Atlantic, where they come from. And I find the natural history of a lot of these seabirds to be absolutely fantastic. And it intersects a lot with sort of other interests I have, things like not just necessarily ecology, but things like history and geography. All of these things are really important when we're thinking about seabirds and how people have sort of interacted with seabirds over the hundreds of years that people have been sailing on the oceans. But I'll start with this one. This one's sort of this is a very common shearwater, the most common large shearwater in the North Atlantic. It's Cory's shearwater. So we think of them as one of our birds, but they breed primarily on 3 sets of archipelagos in the Eastern Atlantic off the coast of Portugal and North Africa. And I have them here, the Azores, Madeira, and the Canary Islands. They're present from, so they breed in the Northern Hemisphere summer. They're summer breeding birds, and they show up here where we are in the summer. So if you go out on a pelagic boat in the summer, you will probably see Cory shearwater. This is when they're breeding. So what this means is that these birds are caring for chicks on these islands in the Eastern Atlantic, and they are cruising, they're doing circuits all the way over into the Western Atlantic to search for food, which is pretty wild. So the birds, they leave their chicks in these burrows. Most seabirds nest in burrows on these islands, and the chicks are, when they hatch, they are just these enormous balls of fat and fluff. I mean, they barely even look like a bird. They are these giant. I've got some photos of some seabird chicks a little bit later, and I'll show you. But they're just like a football or a volleyball that's vaguely bird shaped. And so essentially this is so that they can be left in these burrows for many days on end while the parents leave and do these long circuits around the North Atlantic looking for food. As we're talking about, this is a blue desert. You have to find your oases where you can find them. And so that's why, the Western Atlantic off North Carolina is such an important place, because that is one of the places where they know that they can find a lot of food. So one of the interesting things about seabirds is that they are, not only are those noses useful for expelling salt, but they are also, they are exceptional trackers by scent. So they track by scent. They're able to pick up extremely minute amounts of fat or oil in the water, and they're able to, they can smell them on a windy day, and they'll go and they'll check it out, because a lot of times that will mean something dead on the surface of the water, either a large fish like a tuna or a billfish or even a whale floating on the water or anything. And then they gorge. Essentially they gorge as much as they can. So a lot of times when you see these birds flying out on the water, they will have this, like, the crop, the area kind of under their neck is like just bulging because they've been gorging on whatever they can find. And then they take them all the way back to the Azores, Madeira, the Canaries, and then they feed them to their chicks and they leave them again. It's a lot of this food is extremely oil rich. A lot of it is extremely fatty, and so these chicks grow very fast. But yeah, Cory shearwater. I love them. I think of them as they're kind of very large and lazy flyers. They're just very easygoing. They have that very gentle face. There's a subspecies of them. So this is Calanectris borealis. There's a subspecies of them that actually breeds in the Mediterranean that occasionally shows up in the Western Atlantic too, called Scopoles shearwater. Perhaps you may or may not have heard that name, but I always think of it as Spicoli from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, because they kind of have that goofy expression on their face. This is another species of shearwater. This is Audubon shearwater. It's also a northern hemisphere summer breeding bird and present for most throughout the summer. They're a small shearwater in the Puffinus genus. That name sounds like it comes from another seabird that you may be familiar with, Atlantic puffin. And in fact, so people the Puffinus genus is a pretty large genus of shearwater, and there's some that breed in the North Atlantic. And back in when the Old Norse were going throughout the North Atlantic, they would eat baby seabirds, and they were not very discriminating about where species they came from. So they would eat puffins, and they would eat shearwaters, and that's where the Puffinus name comes from. Interestingly enough, the Leherminieri part is the name of a French ornithologist. So Audubon shearwater is one of the few birds that's scientific is named after one old ornithologist, and the common name is named after another. That's just a random piece of trivia you may or may not find interesting. So this is a Caribbean breeding bird. They breed throughout the Caribbean, so they're actually quite a common shorebird. You can see that I have there in the corner there. That is a baby Audubon shearwater. The babies are actually heavier than the adults. When they hatch, they come out of these burrows. So Audubon shearwater nests on a lot of the islands throughout the Caribbean. They dig these burrows a lot of times well inland. They're not on the shore. They're in forests. And the Audubon shearwater kind of plunge through the forest and then waddle along the ground until they get to their burrows with their giant babies, and they feed them. So Audubon shearwater, much smaller shearwater than the Cories, has a very long, kind of broad boat-like tail, which that very much stands out in flight that you can notice when you're seeing them. This is a great shearwater. They breed in the Northern Hemisphere winter, and they're present throughout the summer in the North Atlantic. Great shearwater nests on an island in the South Atlantic called Tristan da Cunha. This is one of the most inaccessible places on the planet. It's only accessible from a 6-day boat trip from South Africa. The archipelago that Tristan da Cunha is a part of is so inaccessible that there actually is an island called Inaccessible Island as part of that archipelago. So they are not messing around. The sailors that discovered this thing is volcanic island, and it is actually one of the most important seabird breeding islands in the world. Not only do great shearwaters nest on this island, which you can see down there in the corner, it's a giant volcano, but it's also something like 85 to 90% of the world population of great shearwater nests on this island. It's also a nesting site for a number of other shearwaters, including sooty shearwater, which I'll talk about later. There are also rockhopper penguins on this island. It is a seabird breeding, paradise. If a dry, barren, stinky island is what you would think of as a paradise, seabird colonies tend to smell very bad. But great shearwater is found here. It's paradise for great shearwaters, and the population was actually declining quite a bit in the middle part of the century. One of the issues that these islands have is because these birds nest on these inaccessible places, which historically have not had any sort of land predators. When sailors came in the 1700s and they discovered it, it was actually a Portuguese sailor who was named Tristan da Cunha that discovered this island. And I do mean he discovered it. I don't think that anyone has ever lived on it. Aside from the random British settlers who tried to name it. There's actually a city on Tristan da Cunha called the Edinburgh of the South Seas, which was a bit flashier name to try and convince people to try and live there in the 1800s. I don't know that it really was very successful. There are no more than about 100 people that live on this inaccessible island, and millions of seabirds. But when people come, things like rats, dogs, pigs, stoats, various other land animals, land predators. And as you can imagine, that can be a real problem for seabirds because they evolved away from any sort of these sort of land predators. And they a lot of times they will lay their eggs in burrows, and some species they will just lay them right on the ground. And obviously easy targets for things like rats and pigs. And so that was a huge problem in Tristan da Cunha. I think they did end up eradicating the island from pigs, which actually helped the seabirds quite a bit. It's still where almost all of the great shearwaters that you are, likely to see in the North Atlantic come from, all from this one island in the middle of nowhere in the South Atlantic. Anyway, great shearwaters are a really neat bird. They're very feisty compared to the Corey shearwaters. And I mentioned this before. This is the sooty shearwater. This, until relatively recently, and I think so, we frequently think of Arctic tern as being the bird with the longest migration of any living bird. But I think it just within about 10 years, they put some trackers on these sooty shearwaters, and they discovered that they actually have a much longer migration, and they end up doing these giant loops around the North Atlantic during their non-breeding season. So they breed in the northern hemisphere winter, which is the southern hemisphere summer. They're present throughout the summer in the North Atlantic. They're actually extremely common in the Pacific as well. But they do this really neat loop where they go off the coast of Brazil, and then they do this giant clockwise loop around the North Atlantic. So we end up seeing them off the coast of North Carolina, off the east coast of North America in May through July, and then they kind of disappear in July. You don't see them anymore. And that's when they really start to turn up on sea watches off the UK, and then down through Africa, all the way back to the Falklands and South Georgia, which are sort of the islands where the Atlantic population of sooty shearwater comes from. But they nest, they're extremely prolific, extremely common, extremely numerous. They are found on almost all of the islands in the subantarctic, all the way around. They're one of the most numerous birds on the planet, which is amazing to think about, considering that they're actually kind of difficult. You have to go out on a boat and go 30, 40 miles offshore to see them regularly. But there are millions upon millions of them kind of cruising around our oceans, which is neat to think about. Talk a little about Wilson's storm petrels. This is another one of those birds that is in the running for the most numerous bird on the planet. They breed in the northern hemisphere winter. They breed in a lot of the same places that the sooty shearwaters breed in, and they're present most of the summer, most of the warm months in the North Atlantic. Storm petrels are really neat little critters. They are extremely small. They're not that much bigger than a house sparrow. And they put themselves through some of the most difficult conditions on the planet throughout these ocean storms and the winds. They're extremely tough and hardy birds, and they do this lovely little thing where they patter around on the surface of the water, paddling their little feet and picking little things off the surface, little tiny things that we can't see. They have a colloquial name they were given by Portuguese sailors called Mother Carey's chicken. It's a reference to Maria and Jesus, obviously, the story of him walking on water. It's a kind of a long route to get to there, but that's sort of where they came from. Storm petrels are another one of those subantarctic breeding. Wilson storm petrels, at least, are one of these subantarctic breeding birds, and they're super cute. Banderum storm petrel is another one. This is another one of those birds that is sort of similar, superficially similar to a Wilson's storm petrel, but they are a little bit bigger, a little bit longer winged, and very much shorter feet that don't drag behind them. They don't like to do that. They don't do as much of the thing where they dance on the surface of the water. Banderum storm petrel is a fascinating species for a couple reasons. Perhaps the biggest one is that we think of it as one species, but it's quite possible that there are multiple species of Banderum storm petrels that look almost identical, but they are different because one of them, the one we call Grant's storm petrel, breeds in the northern hemisphere winter. It's somewhat common in the Gulf Stream. They see them more often than not. And yet there's another one called the Madeiran storm petrel, Banderum storm petrel, that breeds in the northern hemisphere summer. Now these two birds breed on the same islands in the eastern Atlantic. They use the same burrows as the other one, but they have sort of a timeshare situation here, so that the Grant storm petrels breed in our winter. And so they, during our summer, when we see them, these are the birds that are going far off into the northern Atlantic, kind of dispersing while they're not breeding. And when they're doing that, this other population, which they might be around in our winter rather, we don't know, goes over to the same islands, nests in the exact same burrows, but they never meet each other. Like they never are there at the same time. So there's no genetic mixing of these two populations. They're just like two almost identical storm petrels passing in the night, which helps. They're nocturnal as well. And how do you tell them apart? Well, it's extremely difficult. But one of the ways we do it is because we're looking at the bird's molt. And I'm going to pause here for a little bit and talk about molt. I know it's one of those 4-letter words that sends birds screaming for the door. But when you think about it this way, birds go through about 2 or 3 major life cycles, issues, major life things in the course of a year. And one of those is breeding, and one of those is molt, and typically migration. And they don't like to do those things at the same time, any of those things at the same time, because all 3 of them are extremely energy intensive, and they don't want to waste any energy doing something else. They don't want to waste any energy molting while they're taking care of babies. They don't want to waste any energy taking care of babies while they're migrating. They do these things separately. So immediately after these Grant's storm petrels finish breeding, so they finish in March or April, they take off and leave these islands and immediately begin molting, because they're finished with the energy intensive process of feeding their chicks. They can apply that energy towards replacing their flight feathers. So when you see a Grant's storm petrel in May or June or whatever, it's going to be missing a few feathers, or some of them are going to be very worn, and they'll have these gaps in their wings. And you can see this picture in the middle. This bird in the middle is kind of a classic Grant's storm petrel. You can see the feathers towards the end, the primary feathers here. One of them is very light brown. That one is worn. That one is falling off. That is, gonna be gone soon. And it makes the plane of the wing a little bit weird. It's got this little notch here in the wing. Now, Madeiran at the same time are feeding their chicks. They are not going to be going through molt. They're not going to be, wasting that energy on molt when they could be looking for food for chicks. And so their wings are going to be more or less perfect, more or less immaculate, like this one that we see on the right. The only problem is the young Grant storm petrels will have clean wings too. So if you see one that is molting, one that is missing some flight feathers, then you know that you've got a Grant's petrel. However, if you see one that's not, it could be a young Grant's, or it could be a Madeiran. It's very difficult. It's one of those identification issues that drives people crazy. But it is sort of fascinating that these birds are speciating, are turning into different species, sort of before our eyes, because they're not there at the same time. They're not there at the same time of year. And they breed in these 4 island groups: the Azores, Madeira, Canaries, and Cape Verde Islands off Europe and Africa. And when you see a Bandrum storm petrel and a Wilson storm petrel together, they look sort of similar. They have that classic storm petrel body type, which is, dark body, dark tail, bright white rump. You can see they're a little bit different. So this top bird is a Bandrum storm petrel, and the bottom bird is a Wilson storm petrel. So the Bandrum has shorter legs. Its legs aren't dragging past the tail tip like they are in this Wilson's. And look, the wings are so much longer. Both of them are showing quite a bit of missing feathers in their wings, so they're both molting. When we see Wilson storm petrels in the North Atlantic, they have just finished breeding. So a lot of times they look like their wings are looking a little rough because they've done with babies. They can put that energy, they can put that time into molt. But you can see, even though they are very similar, they're actually pretty different. And this actually means that they fly quite differently as well. Wilson storm petrels, shorter wings, broader wings. They flap a little bit more like little bumblebees, whereas Bandrum storm petrel looks like a miniature shearwater with very long wings, very fast flyer. And then we got Leach's storm petrel, which is the third one. I think this bird is really interesting because almost all of the bird, they nest in the North Atlantic. They nest up near Newfoundland. And something like 75% of the world's population nests on this Baccalieu Island off of Newfoundland. But actually, there are a lot of Leach's storm petrels that nest on the islands that people travel to Newfoundland. If you've traveled up to Canada, they're really big on their puffins. You can see a lot of puffin colonies up there. They're very cool. And I had the good fortune to be up there last summer. And my friend who was a Newfoundlander was saying that, on these islands that we were sailing past, there are hundreds, thousands of pairs of Leach's storm petrel, but no one ever sees them because they only come to the nests after dark. They only arrive after dark. So you might be able to hear them if you're out after dark, but you almost never see them. And during the day, they're out feeding, they're out looking for food, and the chicks are in the burrows. They're deep under the ground. And then after the sun goes down, that's when they come back, and then they leave before the sun goes up again. So you've got these islands with thousands of pairs of Leach's storm petrels, but you never see them. It's just such a weird thing. These are the present in the Gulf Stream from May to October. They are very similar to bandurump, except they have that cool little notched tail. Leach's storm petrel is another one of those weird storm petrels that they have subspecies in the Pacific Ocean where one is a summer breeder, one is a winter breeder. They don't intersect with each other, so they're probably different species. There's a lot of that in seabirds. One of the things that I love about these birds is that there is just so much that we do not know about them because they live such secretive lives. And every opportunity you have to see them is an opportunity to learn something that maybe people didn't know before, which is a really neat thing. The classic bird of the Gulf Stream, the landlord of the Gulf Stream, I like to call him, is the black-capped petrel. North Carolina is one of the really fantastic places to find this species. This is really a wonderful seabird. They fly around like Ferraris. They are so agile in the wind, coursing up really high, dipping down in the troughs. They're really dynamic flyers. They breed in our winter. So they are Northern Hemisphere breeders, but they breed in the winter. And they breed, we only know that they breed in 3 places in the world. And those 3 places are on the island of Hispaniola. 2 of them are in Haiti, and 1 of them is in the Dominican Republic. This I've shown on the map here, this Massif de la Haute, Massif de la Sal, and Sierra de Bajaruco. These are all 3 volcanic islands, volcanic mountains. So this is a seabird. This is a classic bird of the ocean, and they nest in the mountains. They nest in holes in the cliffs way up high in the mountains. And it is pretty amazing that these places are protected. I don't know how much you may know about Haiti. It is the poorest country in the Americas. They have gone through a really tough time of it through various dictators and bad leaders, to the point where they did not take very good care. The country did not take very good care of its environment. So a lot of the mountains are deforested, except for these places, this Massif de la Haute and Massif de la Sal. To their credit, they have been protected. And partially that is because the birds, these black-capped petrels, nest in areas that are extremely difficult to get to. So there's a lot of subsistence, gathering of wood among Haitians. And fortunately, these are protected islands. These are national parks to the extent that anything can be protected in a country as poor as Haiti. But they're very difficult to get to. And that has been sort of the saving grace for these black-capped petrels. Here in North Carolina, here's a baby right here in the corner, young black-capped petrel. They nest in these craggy cliff holes in the sides of cliffs. And one of my friends here in North Carolina who works for the Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh is one of the researchers that's done a lot of work going and finding the nest sites of these black-capped petrels. Another name for the black-capped petrel is the Haitian name is diablatine, which means little devil, which is a reference to their really weird calls that they make as they're flying in to the mountains overhead. So they're way inland. Imagine you are a farmer or whatever, and you're in the lowland and you hear these weird devilly whooping calls coming over you after the sun goes down. of these diablotines, of these black-capped petrels, going to their nesting sites in the mountains. You can see here some of the researchers going and finding these nest sites up here in the corner. You can see this is not like anywhere very near the ocean at all. This is the one in the Dominican Republic, the Sierra de la Barajuco, and they are on these very forested mountains. These are conifer trees. These are pine trees. This is like Colorado up in these mountains. And these diablotine black-capped petrels nest in these little crags in there. You can see on the far right side, there is an arrow pointing. That is where the nest is. They're extremely difficult to get to. And that has sort of been what has protected them over all these years, because seabirds are, because the babies are so fatty and oily. When in the 1700s, when sailors, British, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish sailors would make landfall at these islands, one of the first things they would do would be to catch all the baby shearwaters and petrels they can and throw them in a pot and boil them up and eat them, because there's a lot of energy and there's not a lot of food out there. So fortunately, these birds were way up in the mountains. And they were extremely difficult to get to. Another cool thing about black-capped petrels, and this is to my point that I made earlier about how there is still a lot of stuff we do not know about these birds' lives, about the natural history of these organisms. They come in two types. There's a white-faced type, which is the one you can see on the left, and a dark-faced type, which is the one you see on the right. One's got more dark on the back. Why this is the case, we don't know. Do each of these birds nest on a different mountain? We don't know. We don't even know where the white-faced type nests. It could be on a mountain that people haven't even discovered yet. They come at slightly different times a year. The molt is slightly different, but aside from that, who knows? It's a mystery that's still out there waiting to be solved when we're thinking about these birds, which is really cool. And I do want to spend a little bit of time on one of the rarer birds, just because I think this is such a wonderful conservation story. This is a Bermuda petrel, Pterodroma cahau. That's, talked about diablotine being the black-capped petrel's name. Cahau is the Bermuda petrel's name. So this is a species that people thought it went extinct in the 1600s. They nested on Bermuda, from their name comes from. Sailors landed on Bermuda. They ate a lot of the babies there. No one knew where they went. They hadn't been seen since the 1600s. Flash forward to the 1930s. One of them hits a lighthouse in Bermuda. The specimen is picked up, sent to the American Museum of Natural History. They're like, this is a Bermuda petrel. This is a bird that we thought was gone for 300 years. Then in the 1950s, a live Bermuda petrel is captured by some scientists in Bermuda. It hits a window. They nursed it back to health and then released it. With them was a 15-year-old Bermudan boy named David Wingate, and David Wingate would become the savior of the Bermuda petrels. So what David Wingate ended up doing over the next 20 years was finding where these birds nested. And he actually found them on these little tiny islands in the harbor, in what's called the Castle Harbor of Bermuda. So this bird that everyone thought had been extinct for 300 years was nesting within eyesight of the city of the main city of Bermuda. As I said, these birds are nocturnal. They come in at night. They leave before dawn. They could easily be there and you'd never know. So what David Wingate started doing was he became the cahau whisperer, for lack of a better term. And he actually went and found where all these birds were nesting. There were only about 12 left. And what he began to do was find all these little islands around Bermuda, all these little islets. And he got rid of all the rats, all the pigs, stripped them clean, started planting native Bermuda plants, and started making these burrows, these artificial burrows for the Bermuda petrels to come back to. And they did. They'd come back to them and they'd use them. And you can see up here in the corner, the left corner, is one of these artificial burrows. They have a little cap on top. So you can pull up the top and you can look inside there and you can see the baby Bermuda petrel in there. And this was really important because white-tailed tropic birds nest in this area as well. And they're much more aggressive. And they will take Bermuda petrel holes. They will take their nesting sites. And so what David would do is if he opened the top and there was a white-tailed tropic bird nesting in there, he'd kick them out and make sure that the area was ready for a Bermuda petrel to go in there. And he did this on what is called Nonsuch Island, which is a little island at the edge of the harbor here. And he turned it into that's this island right here down in the bottom left. And he turned it into like this native Bermuda habitat. He made sure that there were native plants on it. He made sure that there were plenty of holes for the Bermuda petrel to live. And they did. The birds came back. And now there are somewhere along the lines of 200 individuals. And they're growing. They're still doing well. He is doing this on other islands around Bermuda. David Wingate retired in 2000. His protege, a guy named Jeremy Medeiros, is now in charge of the Bermuda Petrel program for the Bermuda government. And the Bermuda petrels the population is doubling every 22 years. And so they're getting better. They're getting better. And it goes to show that, we hear a lot of sort of bad environmental news. I'm sure we're all conscious of that. But the neat thing about these seabirds is that because they are sort of concentrated on these one islands, is that fixing those one islands, making that place better for these seabirds can show immediate impacts to these populations, as they did for the Bermuda petrel. They're still not out of the woods yet, but they see them almost every year off the coast of North Carolina, which is pretty remarkable considering how far they were in the 1950s. Bridal tern is another kind of classic. I'll move kind of quickly through these next few because they're done with the toed noses. But bridal tern, sort of a fascinating bird. If you've been to southern Florida, you know that that's where they breed. They come up into the Gulf Stream. They follow the Gulf Stream every late summer. They're kind of known for liking to sit on flotsam. So anytime there's driftwood or whatever floating in the sargassum, they like to sit on top of that. And frequently that means garbage that they're sitting on, which isn't very photogenic, but that's how you see them a lot of times. And Arctic tern, which is another kind of classic pelagic species. Arctic tern famously has one of the longest migrations of any bird on the planet, traveling between the Arctic and the Antarctic every single year. You can see there on the bottom right, the roots of these birds when they have little trackers on them, which is I think is one of the coolest pieces of bird science that's being done in the last 10 years. You can see that they don't just go back and forth between the Arctic and the Antarctic. They actually cruise over into the Indian Ocean too. So you get three oceans. And another classic pelagic species, white-tailed tropic bird. I talked a little bit about them in context of the Bermuda petrel and how they like to take the nesting areas of the Bermuda petrel. But tropic birds are sort of amazing species. If you're out on a boat, they will. I think this is just my theory. They like to stay way, way, way up high, and if they see a boat, they'll come down and circle around the boat. They're funny in that a lot of the pelagic birds, if you're watching for them, you can see them coming off the horizon from a long distance away, whereas tropic birds, you'll just look up and there'll be like a tropic bird there you didn't even see coming. This is one of the Caribbean breeding ones. They sometimes have apricot tails, which is kind of a neat thing. And Jaegers and skuas, another pelagic species. These are primarily Arctic breeding birds, the Pomeranian Jaeger and the long-tailed Jaeger here, and South Polar skua. They are predators. They are not birds that are picking off sea creatures like the tube noses and the tropic birds and the storm petrels and whatnot are. They steal birds. They're pirates. And in fact, the family name Stricorarius, there's a funny story about it. Back, a long, long time ago, hundreds of years ago, when people looked at these birds and the way that they chased seabirds, what they would do is that they chase the birds until those birds void their crop. So birds have an organ between their mouth and their stomach that holds food in storage. And what the Jaegers will do is they'll chase them until they throw that up, and then the Jaeger will scoop up and take it, and that's how Jaegers eat. So a long time ago, people thought that they were chasing the birds until the birds defecated, and the Jaegers were scooping that up and eating the bird poop. which is actually where the name comes from. Stricorarius means dung eater. So next time you see a Jaeger, you think, no, that it is a dung eater. Obviously not true, but it stuck. You don't just see birds out on the Gulf Stream. You see lots of other cool critters as well, including flying fish. There's tons of different neat species of flying fish that are out there, and more are being discovered. This is one of the organisms out there that people don't know a ton about. None of these fish have common names. Steve Inge Howell, who you may be familiar with as a field guide author, actually wrote a book about flying fish, and he gave them all common names. A lot of ichthyologists got kind of ticked off about that because he just came up with random names, but a lot of them are very creative. Like this one down in here at the bottom left is called Midnight Wing, which I think is very evocative. And also marine mammals as well. This is a sperm whale, one of the more common species of cetacean that you run into in the Gulf Stream. Because the continental shelf drops off so deep, so sperm whales hunt in extremely deep waters. They look for squid primarily. So at the area where the continental shelf drops off, you will find sperm whales kind of laying on the water like big logs. They don't really do a whole lot. For such a cool and for such a cool creature, you'd expect it to be a little more exciting, but this is actually what they look like for the most part. And those aren't the only cetaceans. There's a number of other cool ones, including Risso's dolphin, which is this one with the scars. The males have teeth and they fight each other, and that's where they get their scars. Pilot whales, spinner dolphins, and beaked whales. Beaked whales are one of the most mysterious species of cetacean in the world. We don't know very much about them at all, but the Western Atlantic is a really great place to see them, including some of the more difficult species like Gervais beaked whale. Sea turtles as well. You can get your herp fix out on the Gulf Stream. The two species you're likely to encounter are loggerhead, which is the one on the top, and leatherback, which is the one on the bottom. Interesting thing about leatherback, it is they actually can control their body temperature internally. So they're sort of warm-blooded turtles, which kind of goes against everything that we know about reptiles, but it enables them to hunt in places that other sea turtles can't, in colder waters. So whenever the Labrador Current comes down and you get like an influx of cold water, you're likely to see things like leatherback sea turtles, especially if there's a lot of jellyfish around, which is what they eat. This is the boat. I'll kind of move past this quickly, but this is the Stormy Petrel 2. When I go out in the Gulf Stream, I usually go at this. Brian Pattison is the captain. He's a great guy, expert seabirder. They usually have it's a lot of fun. This is a drone photo, or actually this is a kite photo. You can see the kite string right there. They put a GoPro on a kite and put it up over the thing and took a picture of the boat. So that's pelagic birding is a really remarkable type of birding. You never know what you're going to see out there. That's one of the reasons that I love it so much. Every trip out is a new adventure. You never know what you're going to see. And, seabirds are pretty fascinating as it is. So thank you for listening to me prattle on about seabirds. My name is Nate Swick. If you're interested in birds or birding, you can email me right there. And if you enjoy me going on at length about birds, you may be interested in the American Birding Podcast, which I host for the American Birding Association. It's a weekly podcast. We talk a lot about birds and birding topics. We cover a lot of ground. If it's about birds, it's stuff that I want to talk about. And there's a new episode coming out on Thursday with a ornithology teacher, a guy who does ornithology with high school students, which is kind of a neat story. So that's all I got. I'm happy to take any questions for you about seabirds or birding in North Carolina, or heck, anything. I'd like talking about birds, so I'll answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Nate. That was I learned a hell of a lot. I thought I knew a little bit about it, but boy, I sure didn't.
Yeah, it's amazing to me where all these things come from, and the stories behind each one of them. It's a really wild group of birds, and really pushes the boundaries of the physical abilities of birds.
So just go ahead and unmute
Oh,
yourself
yeah,
if
yeah,
you
yeah.
have any
Hold on.
questions.
So how
I
does
will,
how does North Carolina compare to like Monterey Bay on the West Coast in terms of pelagics?
Yeah, so I'm a North Carolina partisan, but the birding on the West Coast is very good as well. But it's different, and it's a different time of year that's best for them. So the continental shelf, I showed you that on the map, is a lot closer to the shore in California on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast. So you can get out. So the birds are typically hanging around where the shelf break is, where it drops off. And you can actually get out to that. It takes about 2 hours on the East Coast. You can get out in about half that time on the West Coast. And West Coast pelagic birding is very much about quantity. There are a lot of birds. The water is colder, so there's more nutrients in the water. So it's not necessarily about the intersection between the warm water and the cold water. It's cold water, and there's a lot of stuff going on in that cold water. So there are like massive amounts of things like sooty shearwaters and large flocks of storm petrels and whatnot. So it's a little bit of a different experience, but I would say an equally satisfying one. Most of my pelagic that I've been on the East Coast. I've done one West Coast pelagic out of San Diego. It was different. The weather's different. It's like walking into someone else's house that has the same floor plan as yours. It's like, this is similar, but it's like weird. It's different in some really weird ways. But yeah, so a lot of bigger numbers, though not necessarily as many species, though they do get a lot of cool stuff there. They have albatrosses, which we can't compete with.
So Nate, this is Rebecca Renfro, and I lived in the Azores as a child. And
Oh, fantastic.
I'm very interested. Back then, of course, it was very rural and pretty underdeveloped. It's mainly my father was a pilot in the Air Force, so we were living there at Lodges Air Force Base. So I'm wondering, of course, now those islands are really becoming much more developed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering on these islands, all these islands where they're, these birds are using for their resources, how are the countries that have, the sovereign countries, how are they trying to help as these islands are being more developed? How are they helping the birds, the habitat? Is there efforts?
That's a good question, and I don't necessarily have the answer to that. I do know that the natural the ecotourism infrastructure is important on a lot of places in Azores, which gets a lot of British visitors. And I do know that they have tried to protect those. Fortunately, a lot of these birds breed in places that are difficult to use for anything else. So they're breeding in like very rocky sort of cliffs or, up in the mountains where it's kind of difficult to get to, where they may not have many grazing issues or people trying to develop up there. So that's, the good thing. But also these birds are nocturnal. So sometimes it can be very difficult to get an idea of how many birds are using a given place because the people just don't see them very often. I think that a lot of these birds kind of go unnoticed in a lot of the places where they nest. I know that's sort of been an issue in Hawaii as well, which, as you might imagine, as these very verdant islands in the middle of the ocean have a ton of really great seabird colonies and these birds are coming in and leaving at night. The biologists there have had a lot of trouble, have had to work really hard telling people that these birds are there and in numbers that would surprise them. I don't know if that's a really very good answer to your question, but I know that that's always a concern for seabird conservationists. How it's going on in the Azores is not something I could speak to, unfortunately.
Well, I appreciate it. That very, very interesting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And effort.
Nate, this is Jay. Are you aware of any kind of research tools such as radar or night vision or anything like that they might use to be able to do censuses for those birds?
Yeah, I know sometimes they do use night vision to go onto these islands and see birds like Leach's storm petrel coming in at night. for the cahao, the Bermuda petrel in particular, they've been doing some stuff where they are putting trackers on these birds to figure out where they're going and what parts of the ocean they are using, to the point where they're, it's funny, they put the tracker, the geolocator, on the bird, and then the bird goes off and does its thing for an entire year, and then they come back to the exact same burrow that they were in before. So it makes it actually quite easy for the researcher to just, take the chip out that they had put on the year before. And they find out that these birds are using like enormous swaths of the ocean. Like they're traveling huge distances. And some, provinces up in Atlantic Canada are seeing that these birds are using, upwellings or undersea features that kind of cause these upwellings, might be good for fish and whatnot, that these birds are using these areas and that we don't even know. But they're finding it out through these geolocating trackers. So that's one of the cool things that they're doing with a lot of these seabirds. As you can expect, the ocean is big and these birds are very small. And so it's extremely hard to figure out how they're using the landscape. We're really fortunate that they come to the coast of North Carolina because it allows us to figure out, to see them at least each year and check them out. Brian Pattison, who does the seabirding trips, does a lot of contract work with seabird researchers. They'll hire him and he'll take them out. This past year, before the pandemic hit, they were trying to capture the black-capped petrels at sea, which seems impossible using these big like net guns, net cannons. As you can imagine, they are extremely hard to catch because they're very mobile on the ocean, and these cannons are not. But there's a lot of kind of interesting things going on with the seabirds, trying to solve the mysteries of them and trying to figure out what they're doing using new technology.
And also, you mentioned that there are no albatrosses. Is there a reason for that?
In the North Atlantic, that's a great question, and no one really knows. So when I've talked to seabird biologists about this, well, historically, there are some fossil records of albatrosses in the North Atlantic. At some point in the prehistory, they nested on Bermuda. They obviously don't anymore. Why? Who knows? In the North Atlantic, we have gannets, which are kind of big, hefty seabirds that kind of fill a similar niche, and they don't have gannets in the Pacific Ocean. So that they think that may be one of the reasons, because these birds travel widely. It's not impossible for an albatross to get in the North Atlantic. We have records of them in the North Atlantic. They just don't come here regularly. Why don't they stay around? Well, maybe it's because there's already another really big, heavy seabird that's kind of filling that niche already. But it's a mystery.
Interesting. Well, they're fascinating to see when you do get to see them.
Yeah. I'm jealous of the West Coast boat operators because they have those.
Yeah, I got to see some in South Africa and New Zealand too. And
oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, the Southern Oceans are they have a much higher seabird diversity than we do in the North, but there's more ocean in the Southern Hemisphere. So
yeah. Well, hey, your presentation was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
John, I learned so much that I had no clue about. So even more respect for those ocean-dwelling birds now, to see how far they travel just to feed the babies.
Mm-hmm.
And wow.
Incredible. Yeah, they're tough. They're tough birds.
Hey, Nate, what's the best season in North Carolina for pelagics? How many boats are in North Carolina going out? What's the frequency and what's the cost?
So let me see. I don't know what the cost is offhand. I could probably pull something up real quick.
Ballpark.
I want to say last time I checked is about 300. And Brian gives a discount if you go on multiple days, consecutive days, which a lot of people do because you never know what you're going to see on day one. The best time of year, the kind of classic time of year, is around Memorial Day weekend. There's a boat that goes out every single day for like 3 weeks, around late May, early June. That is the time when you have the greatest diversity. That's when, the Southern Hemisphere breeding birds are arriving. They're here. That's when the Northern Hemisphere breeding birds are sort of lingering. So you get things like skuas and Jaegers and Sabin's Goal maybe and Arctic tern that breed up in the Arctic, but they're still kind of hanging around here before they get up there. And that's when you get all the Eastern Atlantic birds there too. So the biggest diversity of birds is like Memorial Day weekend kind of area. But they do trips every week, most weekends throughout the summer, throughout the warm months. The reason that they don't go out in the winter is more just tradition more than anything. Like we're still at the point with a lot of these boats that like we don't know enough about some time of year. You know, people go out around Memorial Day because that's when people have always gone out, and it's been good luck. But, you know, you could have good luck around Labor Day, but there's never been a lot of boats out there. It's like a chicken and the egg thing. How do you get the interest from birders? How do you convince birders to put out the money to like go out on a weekend that historically we don't know as much about? You know, you want to take the sure thing, and you kind of understand that. But as the summer kind of wears on, you start to get bigger numbers of shearwaters and petrels, though not as much diversity. And then into fall, we don't know a lot about it. So yeah, and so there's essentially one guy. There used to be a couple. Sometimes Paul Gurris from around New York comes down and goes out of Oregon Inlet, but primarily it's Brian Pattison and seabirding out of Hatteras, North Carolina. That is like the main show. And he runs a good ship. I've been on a bunch of different pelagic boats, and I'm not just saying that because he lets me come on his boat every once in a while for free and look at birds and point them out to people. But he runs a very professional organization. They do a good job, and they see a lot of neat birds and a lot of neat sea life, not just birds, but other cool stuff too.
Is there have you noticed any, or have, in general, changes in distribution due to climate change?
Not so much with the birds, but definitely with the fish, with the other stuff. I mean, I think that, they are, and this is, just from hearing stuff from the fishermen, the offshore fishermen out there, they're seeing more stuff that they typically associate with further south. And as we do that, I'm sure we're going to start seeing birds too. Things like red-footed booby. We finally got one in North Carolina for the first time. We've been expecting it for decades. It was a cruise ship. It was way offshore. We haven't gotten one from one of Brian's boats yet, but it's probably coming. As those things creep north, we're going to start seeing the southern birds as well, I think. But a lot of these birds, they are pretty well able to take advantage of that stuff. They're on the lookout for that stuff anyway, like these minor changes in ocean temperature. And, that's sort of what they're keyed in on anyway. And, the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream, the intersection there and the continental shelf is not going to change. But it will be interesting to see what happens as this stuff moves up. It's a giant science experiment that we don't know the results of it. It's just a wild thing.
Well, if there's no other questions, I will mention that Nate was scheduled to be our keynote speaker at the Lesser Prairie Chicken Festival this year. And he was not going to talk about pelagics, though, at that festival.
No. I'm saving those for when it does happen. I'm saving my talks for that one.
Yeah. Although maybe that frigate bird went over the panhandle out to western Oklahoma, but
who knows?
If we do have the festival next year, Nate will be back. Well, he'll be back next year.
Yeah.
So it's, I think it's a iffy if we're even going to be able to have it next year. So maybe 2022.
One of these days.
If we're
one of these days.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're booking yourself that far out yet, but we'll eventually get him here at the festival.
Yeah. So. No, I got to see those. Prairie chickens. I gotta.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we are done then. So thank you again, Nate, for spending some time with us. It was great. So
great. Yeah. Thanks for having me.